I remember how interesting I thought it was when I first found out that almost 1,000 years ago, a man named Saint Anselm of Canterbury came up with what is essentially a mathematical proof for the existence of God. It makes you wonder, why did people ever doubt God after a more or less mathematical proof of him popped up that long ago? And why hasn't everyone heard of the argument? In other words, why didn't Anselmania run wild for the 1,000 years that followed? Well, first off, there was, and still is, valid opposition to the proof, which I plan to address a little of. But first, I'd like to take his argument and make it look like a mathematical proof that we'd usually see in a fairly modern textbook on logic or mathematics. This may help us understand the proof better. I want to do a little more than just translate this thing, though. I'd like to evaluate it for accuracy to my satisfaction if possible. The problem is proofs can't really be tested empirically. So what I think I'll do after I put it in symbolic notation is replace the symbols with something else and see if that argument makes any sense. It's sort of like testing a mathematical formula by plugging in new values and seeing if it's still true. We're just doing this for a symbolic argument here. This is about all we can possibly do to find out why Anselmania didn't run as wild as you'd imagine it would. I will use the standard mathematical notation symbols shown on the left of the screen here, and notation specific to this proof shown on the right. At the top right is a symbol used often in probability, but I'm not sure how often it's used in formal logic. Now that we have some notation, the first step in this proof is to define what God is. Anselm defines God as the greatest thing that can be thought of. We'll call this definition Axiom 1. I am showing a logical notation expression of this at the top, a somewhat literal translation of this in red below the notation, and in blue at the bottom, how we might state this expression in everyday language. We call this an axiom because it's something you have to go along with in order to proceed with the argument that follows. If you don't agree with it, the proof won't work. But that doesn't mean the proof is logically invalid. You can have a logically valid proof based on bad axioms. It's just that the conclusion will fail even though the steps don't. Well, if you were able to get past Axiom 1, at least for the sake of discussion, here we go on to Axiom 2. It's not very exciting. It just says we can imagine God being real, and we can imagine God being pretend. Pretty simple. On to Axiom 3. This says that since we can imagine God being both real and pretend, the thought of him being real is better than him being pretend. It's based on the idea that actually having something that's wonderful is better than simply dreaming of having something that's wonderful. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But let's go along with that as well, especially since that's the last axiom we have to deal with. Okay, based on these three axioms, that God is the greatest thing we can think of, us being able to imagine that God is real or God is fake, and a real God being better than a pretend God, Anselm claims we can logically prove that God is real. Let's see how. First, we state what we want to prove. We want to prove God is real, so we write this intention down. Now we'll attempt a proof by contradiction. We'll assume the opposite of what we're trying to prove. This is the assumption that God is just pretend. If we arrive at a contradiction after assuming this, provided every other step in the proof is logical, then we can conclude our assumption that God is pretend is false, and we can conclude that God is real. Using our axioms, axioms 2 and 3, we can string together the idea that if God is just pretend, then we know he can't be the greatest thing we can think of, because the pretend God isn't as good as a real God, and we can sure think of that. Already we see a contradiction. By assuming God is pretend, we say he's not the greatest thought, even though in Axiom 1 we defined him as the greatest thought. So we shouldn't have assumed God was pretend if we wanted to stay consistent with the laws of logic and our initial axioms. Since assuming God to be pretend is false, we must conclude he was real. And that concludes the short mathematical proof that God exists. But you know, I'm not the greatest guy to understand informal logic sometimes. This proof looks logically valid based on my old undergraduate training. But I'm going to go back to my initial strategy and replace these symbols with other things that have nothing to do with God and see if I get an argument that still makes sense. I watch a whole heck of a lot of old professional wrestling footage on the Peacock streaming service, and that inspired me to replace the symbols in this proof with pro wrestling stuff. So even if it seems off-putting, I'll replace the variable that originally represented God with the wrestler Steve Austin, the variable that represents thought with the term wrestler, and the variable for something being real with something being in the old World Wrestling Federation wrestling promotion. This changes the argument into something like the following. Steve Austin's wrestling character is the most popular ever. Steve Austin had separate wrestling characters like Stone Cold Steve Austin in the WWF and Stunning Steve Austin outside the WWF. The Stone Cold WWF character was much more popular than the Stunning Steve character in other promotions like WCW. If Steve Austin was not in the WWF, sticking only to the Stunning Steve character, we know that there was a more popular character than him, the Stone Cold character. But we already said Steve Austin's character was the most popular wrestler ever. Therefore, Steve Austin must have been in the WWF, because he was the most popular wrestling character ever and wasn't the most popular during his WCW days. This isn't nearly as pretty as I hoped it would be. Perhaps Anselm's argument isn't so logically valid because there's some messiness here. With this example in particular, one of the axioms says a version of Steve Austin was in the WWF, and him being in the WWF is the conclusion we want to show. That's no good because it sure looks circular. And I remember a YouTuber named Arctic Pangolin 3090 helping me clarify these ideas with regards to Anselm's claim. Of course, many people claimed circularity in the argument probably for centuries, but the ones who just claimed circularity and wrote the argument off without attempting to claim why it was circular probably just possessed a biased opinion. But maybe I didn't translate Anselm's argument into logic correctly. Maybe I should try again. Or maybe Anselm messed up and I can make it better. In either case, let's try to improve what we have here to eliminate the issue detected in this example. I think part of this example is it concerns past items we already know. It might be different if we change it to future tense. Also, I think we should make it very clear in the first axiom that it should apply in both cases of what we're trying to test. So our newer, even shorter argument would be pretending we're in the year 1986 or something, before Steve Austin's debut, and we'll claim that he will be the most popular wrestler ever someday, making it clear that he will be that way regardless of whether he was in the WWF or some other promotion. Then we'll make it clear that he will not be the most popular wrestler ever if he is not in the WWF. With these two axioms alone, if they are somehow guaranteed to be true, we can definitely conclude that Steve Austin will one day be in the WWF. This is a variation of a well-known logical argument known as a disjunctive syllogism. It's where you have two options to begin with, you eliminate one option, and only one possibility remains. Initially, we knew here that Steve Austin would either be in the WWF or not, but then with more information revealed, we found out he could not be outside of the WWF forever and still fulfill our initial axiom. So, with that option eliminated, we found out he definitely had to be in the WWF. So let's try to change Anselm's argument into a form of a disjunctive syllogism if it's not in that form already. We'll do it in English first, then translate it into the formal notation. I feel much better about this particular logical proof of God's existence being valid. However, Axiom 1 in this case is ridiculously powerful. We have to think that even a fake God would be the greatest thought ever if a real God didn't exist. How many people would think a pretend God is the best thing anyone could think of? I wouldn't. And Anselm's original argument requires us to believe this, but it's not quite so explicit. That's why I tried to make it more explicit that God needs to be the best ever, whether he's real or not. I added the whether he's real or not part. Anselm didn't have it, and I think it caused confusion. But if you say God's the best ever, period, it should apply under both conditions. So we find out that indeed, if Anselm's original argument wasn't as consistent as a mathematical proof, we can most likely turn it into something that is a real, actual, valid mathematical proof without too much effort, and then point out that one of the axioms appears extremely problematic. At least that's my take on it. I said at the beginning of the video that there have been objections to this argument for quite some time. One I don't see is that if we can imagine God being real, we can also imagine him showing himself to be real extremely clearly right this second. And wouldn't such immediate revelation be better than him not doing it? Yet empirical evidence doesn't confirm this. I really thought Anselm's ideas were extremely clever, and I think he honestly believed them. And for a time I did too. I think I read in Wikipedia that even Bertrand Russell had a tough time finding where the problem was in the argument. I was intrigued by this argument for quite some time, and it's very likely at some point I will be again. But if I want to be the man that tells it like it is, like Jesse the Body Ventura always claimed to be during his career as a commentator, I need to point out what I see when I see it. I do not think we'll ever see a mathematical proof of God where everyone agrees with the axioms. I think I glanced at Gödel's version, and when I saw the axiom necessary existence is positive, I didn't immediately scream, "That's something I can clearly accept." I'm pretty sure God wants to keep himself mysterious and have us rely on faith. Why? I have no idea. But the inductive reasoning of repeated failed proof attempts and the biblical doctrine itself tell me that you're not going to reach God in this kind of way, as intriguing as that might sound. It's kind of a beautiful idea, though, that if you think a pretend thing is the best thing ever, that it might in some way actually become real. Reminds me of the old Calvin and Hobbes comic strips, actually.